Okay, so what I propose to do today is to begin in on argument assessment, sort of the second half of the skills we're going to learn in this course. First, we'll go over probably this is so long ago that you didn't bring it or don't remember, but there's a worksheet that we didn't get to after the last class before the test on definitions and analytic and synthetic claims. So I propose to go through those quickly at the beginning, and then we'll talk about assessing arguments, and then probably that'll take us through 1 hour, and then the second half of the class, I'd like to just do some argument assessment. So we'll do the same thing that we've been doing so far, which is to sort of map the argument out, but then we'll take the next step of asking, okay, is this argument any good? Why or why not? Which parts work and which parts don't? And we're going to be dealing with, so far all of the arguments that I've had you look at either came from me specifically writing them so that they would be straightforward to analyze, or took them from a critical reasoning textbook. And today we're going to start in on the much more frustrating and ambiguous task of dealing with arguments from out in the wild, as it were. I pulled a couple of arguments off the internet for you to analyze. You'll see that they're much, much messier. So dealing with that kind of messiness is going to be the main project for the next month or two in this class. This is the vague, ambiguous stuff that really is the point of this class. Like that's the reason why you'd be in this class rather than symbolic logic, where there is none of this messy ambiguity. Learning to deal with that stuff is really going to be, the main project from here on in. So look forward to that. But just to start, any kind of course mechanics questions before we start? I'll remind you that I messed up the syllabus, and also I'd like to move the test from a Tuesday to a Thursday so we can write in this room. So on Tuesday of next week, I announced this in class on Tuesday this week. On Tuesday of next week, we'll vote as a class, and if more than 50% of you accept the changes, I hope you do, then we'll move to the new revised syllabus. So the revised syllabus is on Blackboard. You can take a look and see if it works for you. Okay? Good. All right, so let's dig in. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm behind on all of my projects. I apologize. So I have not yet updated the multiple choice marks, and I have not yet uploaded the lecture from Tuesday. I'll do those as soon as I can. Yeah. Okay, so recall this stuff about definitions. So we said that definitions can be too broad in the sense that they include things that they shouldn't include, or they can be too narrow in the sense that they exclude things that they shouldn't exclude, or they can be circular, where they presuppose the thing that you're supposed to be defining in the definition, and therefore don't really give you any information about what the thing is. So those are the three, and looking over these one more time, we should add a fourth way in which a definition can be inadequate, which is just that it's horrifically vague and you have no idea what it's saying. So that's another way that a definition can fail. These are all ways in which a definition can fail in a precise and clear way. So if you say exactly what you mean, but it turns out to be too broad, then you failed, but at least you said something. Whereas some definitions are really just like incoherent mush. So that's a fourth category of ways a definition can go wrong. So here's a classic one from philosophy. Did we go over these already? I felt like I went over one or two of them with one or two of you, but not as a class. Okay, so here's a classic one from ancient Greek philosophy. Humans are featherless bipeds. Biped just means you have two legs and you walk on them. Yeah. Too broad. So what does it include that it should not include? If it's too broad, that means that you're trying to draw the definition exactly around the thing. If it's too broad, it's including things that it shouldn't include. So is there an example? Okay, so in that case, it should exclude some things that it shouldn't exclude. Okay, good. That's you've gained knowledge. Yeah. In what sense?
I mean, there are so many featherless bipeds who aren't.
Such as?
Apes.
Good. They generally don't walk on two legs as their main mode of getting around, but sorry?
Penguins.
Penguins have feathers. Yeah. Good. This is actually, so this in the history of philosophy, this was somebody offered this as a definition of humans, and some smart aleck plucked a chicken and brought it to them and said, "Behold, a human," and that was the refutation of this definition of what it is to be a human. Yeah. Okay. So in that sense, so because you can pluck a chicken and it's a featherless biped, this is too broad. It might also be too narrow, in the sense that not all humans have two legs that they can walk around on, of course. I hope that you're fortunate enough to have that be true of you, but enjoy it while it lasts, because it might not last forever. Like lots of us get to the point where you can't walk on two legs anymore, and you're nonetheless still a human being, right? I would take it. Okay, so too broad and too narrow. And if you recall what I was saying about definitions and how slippery they are and how there's probably not really great definitions in anything but like math and logic, too broad and too narrow is probably going to be the standard case. Like most definitions that you can give will probably be not quite right in both directions if you're picky enough about it. Okay, so too broad and too narrow. Libraries are buildings where you can get books. Too broad, too narrow. Yeah?
Too broad, because there are other buildings where you can get books.
Excellent. Bookstores, for example. Yeah. Is it also too narrow in some sense? Yeah? Yeah.
I was going to say it's too narrow because libraries can like do other things too.
Absolutely. You can get audio books, or you can get like near my house there's a tool library where you can take out, you pay a subscription fee and you can take out tools to use, which is pretty cool. So that's a kind of library, right? If you accept that that's actually a library. And again, just to like really, really hammer on this, there's not necessarily a fact of the matter about what exactly is contained in a concept like library. One person could say, no, when I say library, I mean the book place. And another person might say, no, tool library, perfectly good library, no problem with that. And there might not, like you can go to the dictionary, but now you're just figuring out what the dictionary guy thought. So it might not be that there is an absolute fact of the matter about this stuff. Okay, home is where you keep your stuff. Easy one. Yeah. Excellent, excellent. And?
It's too narrow at the same time. Maybe I don't keep stuff that I just keep.
Right, you could have a home that's empty of your stuff. You don't have any stuff in it. Maybe it's a new home that you just moved into. Nonetheless, if you just like lay your body down there and pay rent, it's your home, right? Good. And you might, in this case, object to stuff. Like if you're defining a word, probably avoid really, really broad terms like stuff or junk. Not very helpful, right? Okay, art is the concrete expression of human creativity. Ah, that's lovely, right? Yeah. Good. So if you want to assume art here means something like visual art or like something like that, music is a separate category. So music is also a concrete expression of human creativity. This definition is too broad. I'm not sure if there's a sense in which it's too narrow because it is really, really broad, right? Like anything, yeah. Sorry? Right, not all art contains an expression of human creativity. Some of it is derivative junk made solely for the purpose of, I don't know, filling ad space or something like that. So yeah, maybe that's too narrow in that sense, or is it? Yeah, too narrow in the sense that it excludes some things that we would call art. Again, it depends what you mean by art. I strongly recommend, I spent like 3 weeks in my first year of undergrad trying to figure out what art means. I don't really recommend that as an activity. It was fairly fruitless. Yeah. Okay. Sedatives are pills that make you sleepy. I don't really know about that. To be honest, I'm not really sure about this one. Like, you might say it's circular, yeah? Yeah? Yeah. Good. So a sedative, you can have a sedative shot, and that's not a pill, and therefore does that make it too broad or too narrow? Too narrow. Yes, because it excludes things that it should have included. Good. So this is too narrow. Is it maybe too broad in some sense? Or, yeah?
Yeah, that's not the only pill that can make you sleepy.
Yeah, a sedative is not the only pill that can make you sleepy. So this, once again, to tediously harp on this, really depends on how you draw the boundaries of sedative and what you mean by that. So if an aspirin also makes you sleepy, but that's not the main point of it, is it still a sedative? And like, I don't know, who knows? So if you define sedative as anything that makes you sleepy is a sedative, then this is always going to be true, right? It's always the case that, you know, they make you sleepy. But if you define sedative as something whose main purpose is to make you sleepy, then things can have side effects of making you sleepy without being a sedative. Like, I guess the lesson here is how pointless it is to try to define words, or how suspicious you should be of all of the definitions that you've been handed, because there's almost always this kind of weird wiggle room, which is another reason to keep in mind the principle of charity, to try to pay attention to what the person you're actually talking to means and intends, rather than saying, no, this is how the word is defined, which is a really kind of obnoxious argumentative move to make. You're like, no, I know what this word means. It means this. You must be wrong about this. Well, typically definitions aren't that crisp such that you could adopt that attitude with any kind of legitimacy. Yeah? Okay. Chairs are four-legged furniture meant for sitting. Yeah?
Too narrow, because some chairs have like two track type things.
Right. I've got that IKEA chair that it's got like two bands of laminated wood. Yeah.
It's too broad because it includes couches.
Exactly. Yeah. Couches can have four legs. They're clearly not chairs. Although it's hard to come up with exact criteria for what makes something a chair or a couch. Like, is a seat and a half chair a chair, or is it a small couch? It's not obvious to me. Probably there's nothing that hangs on it, so who cares? But yeah. Okay. Children are small people. What's that? There's loads of small people that aren't children, yeah? Right? People come in a variety of sizes. Some of them are not children and nonetheless are small. So this is too broad. It includes things that shouldn't be included. And if you think that there can be large children, I suppose there could be large children, then this is also too narrow. Yeah? Again, remember what we said about the sort of relativity of some of these terms? So small is almost always a comparative term, which assumes a contrast class. And usually that contrast class is fixed by the context. So like who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, and all that determines what you mean by small in a context. So having one of those words in your definition, and again, it opens up this whole range of vagueness and ambiguity that, like, if you're trying to get an exact definition, is probably not going to help. All right. Okay, so that was the definition side. We did the other side. We'll do the other side of this thing now. So shift gears mentally here. So we're no longer trying to come up with definitions of these terms. So these are not meant to be definitions anymore. They're just meant to be descriptions. A distinction which I obviously should have kept more in mind when I was designing the midterm, because I was asking questions assuming that we were doing definitions, but not saying that we were doing definitions, and that got me into trouble. So good to keep in mind the difference between trying to define a term, trying to give necessary and sufficient conditions, and just making statements or descriptions like this. So leaves are green, clearly garbage is the definition, right? Because there's lots of green things, and furthermore, not all leaves are green. So no good as a definition. It's fine as a generic description, right? Now, okay, so the task is no longer to talk about these as definitions. Now the task is to say, are these analytic, are they synthetic, or are they contradictory? So something is analytic, just in case it's true based on we're still dealing with definitions, because we're talking about whether it's true based on the definition of the word or the grammar of the sentence. And it's synthetic if it's not true based on the definition of the word or the grammar of the sentence. Maybe it could be true for some other reason because of the way things happen to be, or it could be false. In either case, it's either synthetic, or if it's false by definition, it's contradictory. Okay? So, all that stuff I just said about how definitions are terrible and hard still applies, right? So when we're trying to separate the analytic from the synthetic, you have to do so on the basis of a definition, but the definition itself is vague. So the distinction between analytic and synthetic will itself be vague. But let's try to deal with these as best we can and say, okay, if I'm trying to be reasonable with what's contained in these concepts, are these analytic or synthetic? So, is it analytic, synthetic, or contradictory that leaves are green? I think I gave you the answer already because I mentioned that not all leaves are green, right? In my house, we've got these lovely clover plants with beautiful purple leaves. There's no green in them at all. They're bright purple. Awesome, right? So, if you mean this as a universal claim, all leaves are green, it's actually false, which makes it synthetic. If you mean this just as a generic claim, so generally leaves are green, which I take it as true, then what is it? Yeah. Well, I think it's not because, again, sometimes it's false. So if it was true just based on the meaning of the words, say generally leaves are green, that could turn out to be false. And you'd still have the word leaves. You'd still be using the word leaves as like things plants use to photosynthesize in your conceptual apparatus, even if it turns out that, so it could be the case that all of the green-leafed plants die and there was only purple and red-leafed plants left. That's a possible thing that can happen, so if it's possible, then you have to actually go out in the world and look to see whether it's true or not. So that's one of the marks of a synthetic statement. You typically have to make some observation to check its truth or falsity. So this is why this stuff is relevant to what we're going to be doing next, where we're assessing the truth or falsity of premises. Some premises are analytic, and you should just accept those ones as true. You don't need any further evidence to accept their truth. Whereas the synthetic ones, you typically have to know something about what's going on in the world to assess them. So I would say leaves are green strikes me as more on the synthetic side of that if you want to know it's true, you got to go look at a tree. Good. Okay, unicorns exist. I get contradictory a lot, so people want to say that this is contradictory. So does somebody want to tell me why this is contradictory? Yeah.
The definition of unicorn still most people accept that it's imaginary.
Okay.
That imaginary does not exist.
Okay. 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 Does anybody want to reply to that? Does anybody want to argue that it's not contradictory? Hang on, you get a new one here. Yeah, hi.
What if you want to accept unicorn as something with a single horn on its head?
Yeah.
That's not the definition of unicorn. I can just say anything but that.
Yeah, I think most people would reject the identity rhinoceroses are unicorns. So that's probably you're sort of pushing the concept of unicorn maybe farther than we want to push it. But do we accept this idea that unicorns by definition don't exist? Yeah.
Unicorns can exist in the pages of a book?
Yeah. I think I'm tempted there to say like the idea of unicorns exists. So this is maybe a helpful distinction, the use mentioned distinction. So if you're using the word unicorn, you're saying in the world there are unicorns. If you're just mentioning the idea of unicorns, you're saying the idea of unicorns exists. And that's certainly true. We have this idea, but I think we should keep those distinct. So let's assume that we're using unicorns in this context rather than mentioning them. Yeah?
Like the definition of unicorn is like an imaginary thing, so it doesn't exist.
Yeah? Yeah? So you're agreeing that it's part of the definition of unicorns that they don't exist. Okay, so now what if we genetically engineered a horse to have a horn growing out of its head? Would you call that a unicorn? Or would you go, no, that's just a horse with a horn on its head? I'm like, everything I've been saying about definitions should convince you that like there is not just one and only one correct answer to this. So we could say like, look, Unicorns are those things that don't exist that look like horses with horns on them. My inclination is to say, like I would certainly want to defend the idea that actually this is a synthetic claim, that the way that you find out that unicorns don't exist is by looking through the world and not finding any unicorns. Right? So that's the basis. The basis of your belief that unicorns don't exist should be the empirical evidence of never having seen a unicorn. I don't know. It's a tricky one because maybe that's not how we found out that unicorns exist. Maybe we found out because we said these are mythical creatures that act like thus and so. Although that's not the origin of the concept. Like it was medieval bestiaries, the books that tell you about mythical beasts and such, told people that they were real. Like they were like, yeah, the unicorns are manticores and all those things, those are real. So at the origins of the concept, people were sort of convinced that they might exist. So it depends on whether you're using the concept as it was originated or the concept as it's presented to people now. So certainly when people teach their kids about unicorns, they teach them first that they don't exist. So it is deep in the concept, and the answer to this question is determined by, do you think not existing is an essential property of unicorns? Or do you think that that's an accidental property that we just discovered? So long as you're clear on what would make this true or false, I'm happy to leave it ambiguous whether this is analytic or synthetic. Yeah? Okay, good. Pure gold is a yellowish metal. Is it analytic or synthetic or contradictory? Like, I don't know. This was certainly how we identified gold for most of the history of humanity. Like this is, gold is the yellowish metal that doesn't rust and is malleable or something like that that was our method of identifying gold. There wasn't another method. So if that's your method of figuring out which things in the world fall under the category, that's a really good candidate for your definition of the concept, right? That's what you do with definitions, is you use them to sort the world into, is this gold, is this not gold? So from that, you could say, yeah, gold, pure gold at least, is by definition a yellowish metal. Yeah.
If any metal was painted golden, basically that's not pure gold, but it's yellowish.
Right. So it's the pure gold here is what makes it tricky. So this is a somewhat gold ring. It's white gold though, so mixed with lots of other things. It's certainly not pure gold, and it's not yellowish. Can you say that like each of the atoms in this ring that are gold are yellowish? That doesn't really make sense. So, I mean, the modern definition of gold is, of course, as an element on the periodic table. Gold is defined in terms of the number of protons and neutrons in its nucleus. That's what makes it gold or not gold. What it looks like sort of has become secondary, right? So it looks to me like we've gone through a kind of semantic shift when we went from identifying gold in terms of its sort of like sensory properties, the things that we can see and smell and touch about it, to defining it in terms of these scientific categories of like how many neutrons, how many protons has it got in its nucleus. So this might have been analytic 200 years ago, and now it's synthetic. That would be one way of parsing this, right? So if you define gold in terms of its place on the periodic table, this is an incidental feature that you have to actually look at the world. Like you can't derive from its nuclear properties how it looks. I take it like we're not there in chemistry yet. So it doesn't follow just from the chemical definition of gold that it turns out to be yellowish, but it certainly was part of the essential definition of gold for, like, we've been dealing with gold for millennia now, so this was like the definition, or at least a part of the definition, for a really long time. So again, ambiguous, I would say. Yeah? Full deck of playing cards includes 52 cards. Analytic. I would say this is analytic. That's what you mean by a full deck of cards. For a standard deck of cards, it's full when there's 52 different cards in it of a certain, they have to be the right cards, but yeah. Yeah? Okay, that was an easy one, I think. Unless somebody wants to make the case this is synthetic. I think that's just how you define a full deck of cards. Yeah?
Just a question.
Yeah.
If I have 52 cards of the same card, that's still not full deck.
Right. So this is a nice case where we should distinguish the definitional from the descriptive. So it is the case that a full deck of cards must have 52 cards, but this doesn't include other things that are also necessary to consider it a full deck of cards, like that the cards should be distinct and they shouldn't be tarot cards or business cards, that they should be diamonds, jacks, spades, and clubs. They should have the following numbers, all of that. So all of that is necessary. All that other stuff that I just said would be necessary for a definition of a full deck of cards. But if we just want to make a true statement about a full deck of cards, this seems like it's okay, right? Like, yeah, that's true. Full deck of playing cards includes 52, and to get the full definition. Good. Okay, further comments on this? Good. Yeah, once again, it's crucial to keep in mind what you're trying to do with a sentence, because that strongly affects like whether it's acceptable or not. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Yeah. I think so. Right, because so, yeah. Interesting. So how do you, okay, so the case for this would be something like, how do you know that naming something else doesn't change how it smells to you? Well, that's a synthetic thing that you observe you figured that out by running around the world. Like maybe if you called roses like stink flowers, people would be less hyped about their smell or something like that. And that would be like a psychological fact about humans. That if you called them something else, people would be like, well, I don't like the smell of stink flowers anymore. So that could be good. This is a good case for this as possibly a synthetic fact. To make this analytic, you would need something like another principle, or there's a sort of an implicit principle that changing the name of things doesn't change their properties. So if you wanted a good deductive argument, changing the name of things doesn't change their properties. Changing the name of rose wouldn't change its smell. That would be like a good sort of like solid argument, but you sort of need more than just this, I guess, to make it analytic. I thought it was analytic. I think I was assuming that principle, right? It's like just changing the name of things doesn't affect how you experience them in a sensory way, but maybe that's not itself like that obvious, right? Otherwise marketers would be out of a job. Like you try to craft people's experience of something by changing kind of unrelated features of it, not intrinsic properties, but like its name and its package and all that stuff. Okay. Good. A rose is a rose is a rose. Now that's analytic. That's analytic. And it's analytic in a slightly different way than any of the other things that we've looked at today, because it's grammatically analytic. So if you just say like A equals A equals A, you don't need to know anything about A to know that that equality is true, right? No information about A is relevant to figuring out whether that's true or false. It's just obviously true. And everything else we've been doing has been digging into the concept and saying, okay, what's in this concept as an essential feature and what's in this concept is just sort of stuff you know about. This time this is an analytic statement because it's grammatically analytic. It's just anything that you plug into that will be true because of the structure of the sentence. Yeah? Good. This, by the way, this grammatical analyticity is kind of the only kind that philosophy really accepts these days. So it used to be the case that philosophers were perfectly happy to call something analytic if it seemed to them that the content of the concept included it. But since we developed modern symbolic logic, we've been able to say a whole bunch of things are now grammatically analytic, and we've been kind of giving up slowly but surely on the sort of like the content of concepts version of analyticity. This was, I think I mentioned Quine presented this kind of devastating argument against the analytic synthetic distinction, and what was left over after it was this grammatical sense of analyticity. So everybody agrees this is a true by definition or true regardless of circumstances all of this stuff about the content of concepts, people are a little more dubious about, except in like special cases where there's some really clear reason why something is an essential feature of a concept, like formal languages. In formal languages, you can say exactly what the content of a concept is. But here we are stuck in natural language for almost all of our lives, so that's why we're dealing with this. Okay, here's another fun one. Water is wet. Analytic. Analytic. Okay, so is ice made of water? Ice is not made of water. What is it made of then? H2O molecules locked into a reasonably steady matrix. So, are we all happy with this? So that, like, look, water is the stuff that's wet. If I ask for a glass of water and you give me a glass of ice cubes, I'll be mad at you. Yeah? Or if I, like, blast hot steam in your face. No, I wanted the wet stuff. I didn't want the scalding gas, right? On the other hand, if you think water, so if you accept water equals H2O, if you say water is identical to H2O, then you have to say that this is synthetic and probably false in general, right? Most of the water in the universe is probably either in a gaseous state or frozen somewhere in the vast expanse of space. Yeah? Okay, so
It can only be said that in layman's term, and you can't really go following layman's term, otherwise it will really stop.
I am a layman, so I have to follow layman's terms. I don't know what else to do. Okay, so the argument is the scientific picture of water says water is made up of H2O. It doesn't say water is identical with H2O. So that sounds plausible, yeah? So what would refute this is if you found a reputable scientist saying something like there's tons of water locked up in the ice caps on Mars, for example. So if a scientist said that, that would be evidence that scientists don't accept this idea that water is always wet. Yeah? Yeah.
So but when they say that there is ice, that's when they know that there can be a possibility of water, because as most go down the code, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. If there is an ice cap, it's quite likely that if you dig deeper and deeper, you get water.
If the planet's geologically active, that is. I don't think Mars is geologically active anymore. But if they said the phrase, we discovered water on Mars locked up in the ice caps, that would be clear evidence that they don't accept that water is always wet, right? If they said there might be liquid water under the ice caps, that would be evidence that they do think water is always wet. But if they just said, like, look, there's tons and tons of water locked up in the ice caps, or, for example, I think this is a plausible one. So scientists talk about water being an element of nebula. So like a cloud of gas in space is a nebula. If they say, yeah, this nebula is composed of 30% water, well, that water is not wet. It's in a gaseous form. Wetness is a sort of viscosity of something that it's in a liquid form, right? So if that's the case, if you find scientists say things like 5% of this nebula is made up of water, then that's evidence that they're rejecting this thing that water is always wet. Yeah? So we have to actually, so I don't know if there's an actual stipulative definition of science of what water is. I don't think anybody bothered to do that, to be honest. I don't think they really need it because we all know what water is, right? And that we can be flexible about whether it must be of necessity wet or whether it's not of necessity wet. Like, it's not, very little hangs on that, I think. So I'm not sure that there's like a settled scientific opinion on it. What you can do then is ask about the stipulative definition. So you do a survey of how people use the word, and then you can find out how people commonly use the word. Yeah? Okay. All right, this is all bizarre and horrible, but. All right, so you can't fit a round peg into a square hole. Okay, well, what if the square hole is this big and the round peg is this big? Well, now it's synthetic, right? And probably false. If the square hole is like a foot wide and the round peg is 3 inches wide, then you can fit the round peg to the square hole. If we added something like you cannot fit an equally sized round peg into a square hole. I think I got this backwards though. Yeah, it should be a square peg and a round hole, shouldn't it? Because a round peg of equal width to a square hole would work just fine. Okay, so I want to add the proviso. So remember, so suppose this is just obviously false. Suppose even with the proviso, we add the, like they're equally width. Look, it's just false. That still makes it synthetic. Okay, so a false statement is synthetic or contradictory if it's false by definition. But if it happens to be false, not by definition, but just by happenstance or by the way things are, it's synthetic. Yeah? Good. Okay. One last. My bicycle is in excellent condition. Once both wheels are straightened out, the broken frame is welded, the tires are patched, the handlebar gets replaced, and a seat is put on. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds contradictory to me, right? For any definition of excellent condition, like if you bought a bike off eBay, they said it was in excellent condition and it needed all of these things done, you would be legitimately mad. You would be justified in being mad and say, that is not what excellent condition means by anybody's standard, right? So that makes this claim contradictory. It's just not a bicycle in excellent condition. Yeah? Yeah?
Could it become analytic if you just change my bicycle will be in excellent condition?
No, so my bicycle will be in excellent condition once both wheels are straightened, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, the thing that would make it analytic in that case is if those are all of the things that you're concerned about. If it meets all of these criteria, then it's in excellent condition, then it would be analytic. If there are things not mentioned here that could degrade it from being in excellent condition to something else, like the brakes don't work. So suppose that all of this is done, but the brakes don't work and it's just ugly or something, or if there are other ways in which it could be in less than excellent condition, then it fails to be analytic. But if that completes the list for you, then my bicycle will be in excellent condition once blah, 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 then that would be analytic. Yeah. Yeah.
Could it be synthetic, based on what you say excellent condition is? My bike is in excellent condition to fix?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so if all of the other bikes in the world are in much worse shape than this, like suppose we're in a post-apocalypse where this bike, it barely works, but it does barely work, then that makes it excellent. So excellent itself is like big and small. It's a relative term, generally speaking, so it depends on your contrast class. So you can imagine circumstances, probably not, Canada in 2017, where bikes are plentiful and generally are much better than this. So it would be a stretch to call today now this an excellent bike because it's got a bunch of stuff wrong with it. But you can certainly imagine a world in which that nonetheless counts as an excellent bike. Like if all the other bikes are much worse, then that rises to the level of excellence. We might grade bikes on a curve. Yeah? Okay. I don't know how I'm going to test you guys on this material because this stuff is just so ambiguous. It depends on so many things, so many background conditions, but I hope that's supposed to be the lesson here, that concepts that looked really straightforward turn out on closer inspection to be not quite as straightforward as they looked. That if you dig into your definitions, if you dig into what you assume you know about ordinary concepts like bloody water and bicycles, it turns out that there's all this background stuff that's necessary to actually make these judgments. And which judgments you make depends on what you think is important in a context. So we'll talk about relevance a little bit today and more coming up, but what's relevant turns out to be exceptionally difficult to nail down. All right, so here it is. Here's the 7 steps for assessing arguments. I would actually recommend these as in general for any argument that you're going to face in your life. if you've got the time and the space. If somebody's yelling at you, you're obviously not going to go through all 7 steps, but these are basically how I deal with arguments. Think about arguments. Maybe not explicitly map it out, but these are actually really handy. So you should be able to see that we've done the first 3 steps already. So what we've done so far in the course is basically learn the first 3 steps. And then all of the rest of the steps are basically things you know how to do intuitively already. So course is over. You can all go home. Okay, not really. We're going to go into much more detail with the last steps here, but really, like, you know how to do all of this stuff already. These are the steps, by the way, that you're going to do on your argument analyses. So essentially, like, we're going to break it down into sections corresponding to each of these steps. I think the sections I asked for, at least in the sample ones, are slightly different than this, but basically this is it. All right, so first you identify the conclusion, then you identify the premises, then you identify the structure. That's how far we've gotten so far. Then you assess the acceptability of the premises. How likely are they to be true? And in the context, is it okay to assume that it's true? Then you accept the relevance of the premises to the conclusion, and then you assess, based on those 2 things, how adequate the argument is as a whole. And then you consider possible counterarguments. The 7 basic steps. So we'll just go through these one at a time just to note a couple things. I think I've said most of this already, but it's worth kind of getting it all in one place one more time. So after reading the whole argument, so what we're going to do for most of the rest of this hour is to deal with these arguments on these sheets. And what I want you to do first is to read the whole argument and figure out what the conclusion is. So you don't have to do it right this second. But, sometimes the conclusion is missing altogether, or you have to kind of reconstruct it. This is hopefully not the case for these arguments. I think they've got explicit conclusions. But in general, you cannot sort of assume that the conclusion is going to be explicitly given to you. Lots of times, if you're in a context where people know what's at stake, they don't say the conclusion, they just assume that you can figure out what they're driving at. So, you know, if you're in an argument with your significant other and you're like, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you know, you're just laying out the premises of your argument, but maybe leaving it implicit that, you know, what they're supposed to conclude, which is kind of a mean thing to do if you're in an argument with somebody, right? Because they might think the conclusion is you're a garbage person and I'm leaving you, whereas you think the conclusion is I wish you would do more housework or something like that. So it can be destructive to leave the conclusion implicit, or it can be helpful when everybody knows what's at stake. Yeah? Sorry? Can there be 2 conclusions? Yes, absolutely there could be 2 conclusions. So it is not always the case that what looks like one coherent argument is all leading towards one conclusion. So that's a good point to keep in mind. There can be sub-conclusions, which I've been calling premises as well. So I've asked you to mark them as premises, but you can think of them as sub-conclusions. So lots of arguments have this kind of like hierarchical structure. So little arguments leading to sub-conclusions, and the sub-conclusions lead to the big conclusion. That's one configuration. Or you can have 2 totally separate conclusions being argued for in the same passage. That's not good writing. Like, you should strive not to do that. Your arguments should, like, if you're presenting one continuous passage of text, it should be driving at just one thing because it's easier for your readers to figure out what's going on. But not everybody's a good writer, so oftentimes there are several conclusions. So, and that's crucial to pick out. It's crucial to be able to identify when that's happening, otherwise you'll be confused about what's going on in the argument. And just to note, really, really often people repeat one conclusion several times or rephrase it several times, just kind of for rhetorical effect, right? So it's more, people find it more convincing and you kind of really drive the point home if you say the argument, say the conclusion a few times, or if you say it in a few different ways. And that can be good, it can be fine. It can also create the impression that you're giving more of an argument than you actually are. So sometimes what looks like an argument is actually just the conclusion rephrased several times, and they haven't actually given you any reasons to believe it. I think that's, so there's 2 arguments here on one side. One of these is an all right argument. The longer one is okay. The short one is a terrible argument. I think mostly what they've done is just rephrased their conclusion a few times. So please do not think I'm endorsing these arguments as good ones. The point is that they're actually really problematic in a variety of ways, and we're going to figure out why. So, but in the interest of operating on the principle of charity, your job should be to pick the conclusion that makes the most sense of the argument, assume that they're giving you a bunch of reasons for something, and pick the conclusion that collects the most of the text into premises that have reasonable relations with the conclusion. And also, don't count repetitions or rephrasings of the conclusion as premises. Again, on the principle of charity, because that's a terrible argument, right? So if you say, you should believe X because X is true, that's a terrible argument. You're imputing to the person a really awful argument that doesn't work at all if you assume that repetitions of the conclusion are themselves premises, right? So just to be clear and charitable to the arguments that you're reading, don't do this. Don't treat repeated conclusions as independent reasons for the conclusion. Yeah? Good. Okay. So next step is identifying the premises. So far, this task has been trivial for you. I have tried to make this task trivial for you. That is, every sentence contained at least one premise, sometimes two premises, but everything was a premise. That was the sort of structure of all of the examples I think that I've given you, so that you don't have to do this somewhat awkward and difficult sorting process. So like, okay, which parts of these are premises and which aren't? When you look at these arguments, that's no longer going to be true. So basically, from here on out, you're going to have to look at the text and say, okay, which parts of this are meant to be reasons for me to believe the conclusion or one of the sub-conclusions, and which of these are maybe explanations of some of the context? Perfectly reasonable thing to do in an argument. Not every move that you're making in the text is necessarily a premise. Sometimes you're just explaining the background, or you're explaining what the other person thinks. Sometimes you're saying things for rhetorical effect, or because you think it's funny, or because you're not trying to write this really tight text. You're trying to just sort of like write something readable. So lots of legitimate reasons for something to be in an argument, that is in the text of an argument, without being a premise. Yeah? And then what we're going to do, so the point of doing this process is for you to sift out just the premises. Right? You can reduce the amount of information that you need to deal with by essentially setting aside, intelligently ignoring the non-premises. Right? And what counts as a premise will crucially depend on what you did in step one, which is identifying the conclusion. So if you identify something different as the conclusion, it's very common for different things to look like premises or not. Right? So shifting the conclusion around shifts the whole structure of what you think are going to be important parts of the argument and which aren't. So that's why we do identify the conclusion first. Right? Everything follows from that. Once you identify the conclusion, it should sort of snap into focus which parts of it are meant to be reasons for that conclusion and which should be intelligently ignored. Okay. And furthermore, so here's another thing that's going to be shifting on you, so be prepared for this change. Mostly I've given you premises in a form that you could just rewrite them word for word. Essentially, you cut out a little bits and pieces here and there, but essentially you would just take the thing as written, say P1, this sentence, P2, that sentence. So that was by way of trying to make this process less painful for you, but it's very often the case that you'll make better sense of the argument if you rephrase the premises. So you can do things like simplify them. So if it's a premise in a long, elaborate sentence, and you can think of a way to kind of get the main idea of it in a shorter, cleaner sentence, do that. Do that. Typically, you're not going to be able to keep the entire argument in your head all at once. Like, humans in general can keep about 7 seconds worth of their talking pace in their head at once. It's called the phonological loop. You can keep about, somewhere between 5 and 9 seconds, and however fast you talk is how many words you can keep in that loop at one time, which is not a lot, right? Like, it's not a lot of words, and the arguments you're going to be dealing with are longer than that. So we're doing compression here. What you're going to try to do is compress the content to be short and simple so you can keep more of it in your head at once. Right? These are just strategies for dealing with the fact that you're running around with a meat computer in your head that has extremely limited capacities in a variety of ways. So we're going to rephrase. You're going to rephrase the premises to make them simpler. You're going to rephrase the premises also to bring out the explicit structure of the argument. So if I say, you know, all dogs are fuzzy, fluffy things are great, therefore all dogs are great, to make that argument make sense, you would rephrase one of the fuzzy or fluffy to match the other one. So you're going to rephrase things to match when the rephrasing doesn't make a big difference to the meaning of the premise, and then that helps you bring out the structure of the argument. Yeah? So we're going to clean these premises up. We're going to simplify them. We're going to rephrase them to fit together nicely and hopefully preserve the intent of the argument, right? So you're not going to rephrase in a way that makes the argument suddenly ridiculous, because that's a mean thing to do and you're not properly engaging, but we're going to clean up the argument. So it's another kind of step in the argument mapping process. So then you map the thing. This is the thing that we've been practicing so far. So once again, you're going to apply, pretty much at every stage, you're applying the principle of charity. Once again, you're applying the principle of charity. You're trying to find the structure that makes the argument the strongest. And this is especially important when you disagree with the conclusion. Okay, so you need to find the strongest version of the argument that you can. If there's if you have two competing structures and one makes the argument look terrible and one makes the argument look all right, go with the all right one. Because you want to confront, especially when you're trying to defeat an argument, the strongest version of it possible. Right? That's how you make your case as strongly as possible. You don't defeat weak, nonsensical versions of the argument and then declare victory. You defeat the strongest version of the argument that you can, giving it as much credibility as you can reasonably give it. You don't go wild with this, but like you try to reconstruct the argument as strongly as you can, and then if you can beat that version, you can beat any version, right? So that's why we do this through the principle of charity. You're also far, far more likely to get the person that you're arguing with to come along with you, because if you just radically mischaracterize their position to make them look dumb, they're going to stop talking to you, right? That's just a super obnoxious thing to do, and they would be very reasonable to disengage. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. And they what?
There are two premises that lead to a conclusion.
Yeah.
One of the premises is wrong.
Yeah.
One is correct.
Yeah.
So in that case,
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Oh, so that's in the assessing arguments stage of things. So hang on for a sec. So far you're not assessing the argument, right? None of this is by way of saying whether this is a good or bad argument. You're just trying to say what the argument is, trying to figure out what the argument is. And as much as you are able, try to refrain from assessing it until after you've done this, because things will hopefully come out at you that wouldn't have come out at you before you did this process, right? So it might turn out that the argument is much stronger than you thought. It might turn out that the argument is much weaker than you thought. And it's really only until you have a definite picture of how the argument's supposed to work that you're in a really good position to make that assessment, right? So when you're just looking informally at an argument, you have a variety of senses of how it is. Like you have some sense, I take it, of how strong an argument is the second you read it. But picking out the structure disambiguates it in a variety of ways. So maybe they mean this thing, maybe they mean that thing. And until you've done that, you're really not in a position to assess it properly, right? Okay, so while you're mapping the argument, it's very common to say, oh, geez, I don't see how this is supposed to connect. there's a missing premise here. So add in missing premises as necessary, keeping in mind the rules that we sort of laid out for what makes a missing premise. Things like it's necessary to make an explicitly stated premise relevant to a subconclusion or the conclusion. Don't just add in missing premises because they would make the argument better. Don't add in independent missing premises. Add in dependent missing premises because they show you how something that was said is relevant to the argument. So keeping that in mind, add in missing premises as necessary. Hopefully they're plausible missing premises, but sometimes the missing premise is totally implausible, and that's something important about the argument as well. So if you're like, look, I have to add in this really dumb missing premise to make this at all relevant to the conclusion, well, that's an important discovery about the structure of the argument, right? And when you're identifying the argument structure, the best outcome is that it fits one of the argument structures that you know, like modus ponens or modus tollens or one of the fallacies or so if that happens, then you're in a really nice position, right? You're in the position where you can say exactly how the argument's supposed to work without any ambiguity. This is why symbolic logic is useful because it greatly expands the number of argument structures that you have to draw on. So if you've got symbolic logic under your belt, that's really nice. In this case, probably the very limited number of argument structures that I presented to you are not going to be sufficient to map every argument that you're looking at. Probably it's going to be the case that many of the arguments that you look at don't nicely fit one of the argument structures we talked about. Don't worry if that happens. That's exactly why we're using this like arrows and lines stuff, because you can represent the structure without saying exactly what the relation's supposed to be. You can't do that in symbolic logic. In symbolic logic, you have to say exactly what the structure is supposed to be. We've left it kind of systematically ambiguous by using the argument diagrams as they exist. So if you can make it less ambiguous, that's great, right? If you can say, this is an example of modus ponens, that's how these premises are supposed to be related to the conclusion, that's the ideal case of argument mapping, right? If you can say, like, this is an existential instantiation, which is a thing from symbolic logic, that would also be a really ideal case of argument mapping. If you don't get to that point, do not panic. That's, built into the structure of argument mapping as I'm presenting it to you is the possibility that you don't have to say exactly what the relation is. Just that these things, typically, one of the nice handy argument structures won't fit, but you'll nonetheless be able to say, this premise is supposed to be related to this conclusion. I can obviously tell that they're offering this as a reason to believe that. I might not be able to say exactly how it's supposed to be a reason, but that it is, okay? So, ideal case, you know which argument pattern it fits, but typically we're not gonna be in the ideal case, so don't panic if that happens. Okay, all right, so that's just the stuff we've done so far. Now we're gonna talk about the assessment process. So you've got an argument laid out, you've figured out the conclusion, you've figured out the premises, you've figured out the structure of the premises, you've figured out any missing premises, you've rephrased things to simplify it. Now you've got it all beautifully laid out in front of you, and you're in a position to start asking, is this a good argument or isn't it? So introducing some new terminology here. It's familiar terminology, but I'd like you to use it. Once again, I'm gonna try to rope these words into our little jargon that we're building up. So forget everything that you know about acceptability, or whatever that might be. In this class, what we're gonna say is acceptability of premises says if a premise is acceptable, then it's either likely to be true or likely enough to be true to be accepted in a context. So this is kind of relativized to the stakes, right? So if your doctor says, yeah, this treatment will probably work, you might think, well, I would like you to be more sure of that, right? Like, just you having the sort of rough impression that it might work isn't really enough for me to accept that as a premise when your life is on the line, right? So if the stakes are high, you might decide that your standards for acceptability should be likewise high. If the stakes are low, for example, if it's a part of the argument that doesn't really matter that much, like sometimes all of the action in the argument is somewhere else, the stakes are low, the conclusion isn't all that important, your standards for acceptability might be lower. You might say, okay, let's accept that for the sake of conversation, for the sake of moving on. Let's question this other thing. So acceptability is just how how likely you think it is to be true given the stakes on the table, right? And acceptability is a property of individual premises. So this is important. Don't tell me that the whole set of premises is acceptable. Tell me about the acceptability of each individual premise. So before you ask yourself, and this is part of teasing out the difference between truth and validity, before you ask yourself, is this premise relevant, or is it interesting, or does it make me believe the conclusion? Before you ask any of that, stop and say, okay, just considering just this premise, is it likely to be true? And how would I go about checking whether it's true or not? Right? This is important cognitive practice because we typically mash those two processes together, right? People have a genuinely difficult time separating the relevance of a premise from its truth. So first, ask yourself if it's true, just by itself. If I say, you know, you should give me a driver's license, I'm a great guy. I'm a great guy might be true. It's irrelevant, but keep that separate in your mind. Say, yeah, you're a great guy. Nothing to do with whether you should be allowed to operate a vehicle, right? So those are two separate questions. Don't let them become the same question in your mind. First, assess the acceptability of the premises. We want to talk about acceptability rather than just truth, because things generally are either true or false, right? Whereas acceptability can come in degrees. So premise can be certainly true, or probably true, or possibly true, or probably false, or certainly false, or like any of the microgradations between them. And the degree to which you find a premise acceptable, again, might depend on the context. How important is it in the argument? How important is the conclusion? Like, do you care a lot about, if the stakes of the conclusion being false are extremely high, then your standards for acceptability should likewise be extremely high. Like, in early atomic tests, the scientists involved were like pretty sure that they weren't going to ignite the atmosphere of the Earth. They were pretty sure. Like, is this nuclear bomb going to ignite the entire atmosphere and kill everybody on the planet, all life being wiped out? I'm going to say like 90% no. And this is true. They were like not sure until they started doing nuclear tests. They weren't completely sure that they weren't going to ignite the entire atmosphere. Now, in that context, the acceptability of that premise, you really want them to be really, really sure, right? Like if the conclusion being false, I think we're not gonna, if the conclusion is we're not gonna kill all life on Earth, and you're only 90% sure of your premise, that's probably not good enough. If the conclusion is we should go for lunch to Denny's, you can be a little more easy on your premises. But just as a broad rhetorical point, sometimes it makes a lot of sense when you're in a debate with somebody to accept a premise that you don't really believe for the sake of focusing on other parts of the argument that you think are more important. Or if you think the real problem with the argument is that it's invalid, then you can say, okay, let's accept your bonkers premise, but now I'm going to say that even if it were true, it wouldn't lead to the conclusion. So that's a reason why you might accept a premise without actually believing it. So this is just reasons why we're separating out acceptability from truth. Okay? Good. Okay. Then you're going to assess the relevance of the premises. So the relevance of the premises is just if they were true, how should it affect your belief in the conclusion or the subconclusion? So if the premises fit into one of the argument patterns, then you know exactly how they're supposed to be relevant, right? So if I say, all living things are made of carbon, I'm a living thing, therefore I'm made of carbon, you say, okay, well, how are those two premises relevant to the conclusion? The best answer is probably, well, by modus ponens, right? By simple inductive syllogism or deductive syllogism, those premises lead directly to the conclusion as a certain truth. So logical validity is the maximum degree of relevance. You don't get more relevant than that. So if you derive a theorem from some axioms, those axioms are as relevant as it is possible to be to the conclusion, the theorem that you derived. But inductive validity is still a kind of relevance. Right? So even if the premises don't lead to the conclusion in a certain fashion, like they're not a guarantee of the conclusion, they can nonetheless be relevant to establishing the truth or falsity of the conclusion. So keep this in mind. Again, just like acceptability, relevance is a spectrum from super completely relevant, like in a logical deduction, to weakly relevant in an inductive inference, or anywhere in between. Okay? And so just like with validity, this concept is very similar to validity, but we'll use relevance because it's kind of different than, well, slightly different than validity. So true premises can be irrelevant to a conclusion, and false premises can be relevant in the sense that if they were true, they would show the conclusion is true. So false premises can nonetheless be relevant. Let's stipulate that. Yeah? Okay. And I'm going to make an argument for you when we talk about relevance specifically. So the plan for the next little while is I'm just going to go through acceptability, relevance, adequacy, talk about fallacies and the sort of problems in those. I'm going to make the case to you that relevance turns out to be just unbelievably complicated and one of the great mysteries of human cognition currently. Like, there is no computer on the planet that can figure out what's relevant. That would be my claim. All artificial intelligence currently works by backpropagation, where you train it up by telling it what victory looks like. So you tell it ahead of time what it would mean to succeed at a task, what's relevant, and then you do a bunch of trials and it gets better and better at meeting that goal, but there's no computer on the planet that can define its own goal, that can figure out what should be relevant. But you can all do that. So enjoy that while it lasts. Because I don't know, it seems like a losing bet to predict that the computer's just never going to figure that out. But currently, we are the only things on the planet, us living things, are the only things that can figure out what's relevant. So, okay, and finally, you assess the adequacy of the argument. So adequacy is the degree to which an argument as a whole is sufficient to demonstrate its conclusion. It's a function of the acceptability of the premises and the relevance to the conclusion, right? So it's just, once you know how acceptable the premises are and how relevant they are, you just compute from that how adequate the argument as a whole is. So, like logical validity, the maximum degree of relevance, so logical validity is the maximum degree of relevance, soundness is the maximum degree of adequacy. A sound argument is 100% adequate to demonstrate its conclusion, right? A logically sound argument. But practically no arguments that you're going to encounter in your life are like that, unless you do math or logic or computer science. So here's the picture. Acceptability times relevance equals adequacy. So imagine acceptability and relevance on a completely made-up scale of 0 to 10, right? There's no reason why there's actual numerical values for that, but just to get the concept. So if your premises are 10 out of 10 acceptable and like 5 out of 10 relevance, you get 50% adequacy. If your premises are 100% acceptable but completely irrelevant, you get 0% adequacy. Yeah? Or if they're 50% relevant or 50% adequate but 100% relevant, 50% adequate. Something like that. The numbers are entirely made up. There's no reason why you would ever assign actual numbers to these. But this is nonetheless the conceptual structure of how acceptability, relevance, and adequacy are related. Adequacy is just the product of how acceptable are these premises and how relevant are they to the conclusion. So important to keep in mind, to say a premise is relevant is not to say that you've said everything that's relevant. Right? So if I say, you shouldn't buy that car, it's been known to have problems. That's a relevant premise to demonstrate the conclusion that you shouldn't buy that car. But obviously there are a million other things that could be relevant, like it's the only car you can afford. It's the only car that's on offer at the moment. You desperately need a car, despite the fact that this one has problems. So all of that other stuff could potentially be relevant to the conclusion. Nonetheless, the thing that you said was relevant, right? So relevance almost always happens in this way where you've given some of the relevant facts, but not all of the relevant facts, except in a deductively sound argument. That's when you've given all of the relevant facts. So if all living things are made of carbon, I'm a living thing, that's all that you need to know. You need to know nothing else about the universe to conclude that I'm made of carbon, right? That's all of the relevant facts have been presented to you because those two premises form a deductive argument for the conclusion. So again, deductive soundness is the maximum degree of adequacy. Okay. Finally, you're going to consider counterarguments. So when you're considering counterarguments, when you're considering an argument, just be aware that if it's anything less than a purely deductive argument with completely adequate or completely acceptable premises, there will be possible counterarguments. This is something that plagues people when they're trying to write essays, because you get 3/4 of the way through and then think of a counterargument. And you think, oh no, this argument is garbage. I have to start all over again because there's a possible counterargument. But that's just to mistake the nature of arguments, right? That any argument other than a deductive proof from totally acceptable premises will admit of possible counterarguments. That's just a fact about how arguments are. So the conversation, in any case other than the pure deductive case, the conversation is still open after you've presented your argument. Don't let that, if you're writing an essay and you think of a counterargument, don't let that stop you. Because the counterargument will also admit of counterarguments. Right? There's always a counter-counterargument. If it's the case that there's always a counterargument, that means there's always a counter-counterargument. So, you know, when you get 75% the way through your essay, you think of counterargument, don't panic, try to think of counter-counterarguments, but also, like, don't think that that makes your argument a bad one, because they all admit of counterarguments. Explicitly, the reason why we make this a step in the process is explicitly considering counterarguments to your position, to the position that you favor, is one of the ways that you can combat confirmation bias. So, confirmation bias. This is a description from Ibn Khaldun. I think he's a 14th or 13th century Islamic philosopher. He says, untruth naturally afflicts historical information, all information. There are various reasons to make this unavoidable. There are various reasons that make this unavoidable. One of them is partisanship for opinions in schools. If the soul is infected with partisanship for a particular opinion or sect, it accepts without a moment's hesitation the information that is agreeable to it. And that's confirmation bias. Prejudice and partisanship obscure the critical faculty and preclude critical investigation. The result is that falsehoods are accepted and transmitted. So confirmation bias is when you treat arguments that you like more nicely, or not even arguments, facts that you like. If a fact fits your worldview, psychologists tell us that you're more likely to accept that it's true. And that's strictly speaking irrational, right? I think it's probably a result of evolution, because like optimists do better. If you throw 100 optimists and 100 pessimists at a problem, like maybe 90% of the optimists die, but 10% of them make it through, whereas the pessimists all give up. If that's the configuration that our ancestors were facing, then like bizarre, irrational optimism would be selected for. So we've all got this built in. I don't know where exactly it came from, but we've all got this built into us, that we pay more attention to information that confirms our ideas than disconfirms it. You don't want to be like that, though, right? You want to be such that you know all of the arguments for your position and all the arguments against your position, right? But that's going to take work. It's going to take conscious, explicit work. It's a pain in the butt. It's uncomfortable. It's like physically uncomfortable to consider arguments against your position in any kind of serious way. It sucks. But if you're hoping to be more rational and furthermore more persuasive and effective in the world, it will behoove you to do some of this work. Because, like, I don't know. I think our political discourse on all sides is horribly infected by confirmation bias. People will accept the dumbest arguments for things that they already believe. They'll just give them a pass. And usually their excuse is, well, I thought it was funny. Like, I see this on my social media is full of this. People just throwing out ridiculously bad arguments for things that I agree with, but nonetheless, they're terrible arguments, and their defense, if called out, is, well, it was just satire. And I think that's a prescription for having a mushy mind, a mind that is unable to actually defend the things that you care about. So that's my polemic on why we do this final step of considering counterarguments, even to things that you care about, even to things that you believe in. Okay, so that's all the new stuff for today. We got 25 minutes or so. What I'd like to do is just go through this argument. This is the sort of less terrible of the two arguments. Let's do it together though. So let's do these steps step by step. So first thing, give it a read, identify what you think is the conclusion. Then we'll talk about the conclusion, we'll figure out what it is, and then go on to the next step of identifying the premises, and so on and so forth. I'm not positive that we'll get through this whole process, but we'll get as deep as we can into it, okay? So give it a read, figure out the conclusion, and we'll come back together. Okay, do you think you know what the conclusion is? Yeah. Okay, so, but I still believe that eating meat is by no means immoral. I think that's pretty much the conclusion, yeah? Does everybody agree with that? Does that seem like the conclusion to you? The link that I've got at the bottom kind of gives it away. It's the strongest argument against vegetarianism. This is clearly an argument against vegetarianism. So the conclusion is eating meat is not immoral. Good. Just for context, vegetarianism is on my mind. I just started being vegetarian like a month ago. So if you're also a vegetarian, I'm not trying to rag on your beliefs. Although this argument against vegetarianism, I would say, is much stronger than the argument for it on the other side. The argument for vegetarianism on the other side is terrible. But we need to distinguish degrees of terribleness. Okay. That's step 4. Let's just get on to step 2 first. Okay. So given this conclusion, eating meat is not immoral, what are the premises? So read through this one more time and say, okay, which bits of this are meant to be arguments for that? And which bits are throwaways, asides, explanations, context, and that kind of thing. So. Let's just go through this. Well, okay, so there's 2 strategies that you could use when you're trying to identify the premises. One of them is to go through sentence by sentence and say, is this sentence a premise? Is this sentence a premise? Is this sentence a premise? And that worked really well when almost all the sentences were premises. It might not work as well as you kind of move into more and more complex arguments. So the other strategy you can use is to read it carefully, identify the conclusion, and then push the argument away from yourself. Stop looking at it, stop focusing on the exact sentences that you're using, and ask yourself, what were the main points? So don't focus on this specific text as much, and just say, okay, what was the main idea of that? What were the main points that were offered? So let's try that. Let's try that second strategy right now. So you've read it once or twice. What are the main arguments given for this conclusion? What are the main premises that are supposed to show that? And we'll try to fit it into an argument structure. Yeah?
It's preferably killed than everyone.
Good. So let's call that premise 1. Okay. So one of the things that happens when you pursue this second strategy is you end up with a lot fewer premises. Like sometimes if you just reflect from a distance rather than go sentence by sentence, you'll probably come up with a lot of premises. This way you might not get as many. Okay, so premise one, that definitely seems like a premise to me, right? This is part of the argument. It's preferable to be killed than to never be born. How do we connect that to the conclusion? So we're kind of working backwards now. Yeah. Yeah, you, yeah.
Oh, not eating meat means that animals are not killed, but it also means that they're
Good. So, can we simplify that in any way? Can we say not eating meat means
animals are not killed, and
maybe just animals are never born? Or, yeah. What about that? Does that capture the same basic idea? So, not eating meat means animals are never born. Is that good as a, so if you want the other half, you can add it in as another premise. Yeah.
I think one of the main premises that the person not eating the meat causes the production value of meat to go down. That causes less meat to be produced or be found.
Good. So is that equivalent to this, or is that a separate idea than this?
It's a separate idea.
Okay. So
It's a justification for premise two.
aha. Okay. So premise 3 might be. Can you say again what the?
Not eating meat causes production of meat to go down.
Okay. Yep. So. Right. So, and if we want to connect up P3 to P2, we need something like if meat production goes down, animals are never born. Yeah? Like if the same number of animals were going to be born whether they were being produced for meat or not, then it wouldn't follow that not eating meat means animals are never born. So we need there's a kind of premise here that's either missing or implicit that meat production going down means animals are never born. Good. Okay. We're getting close. We're getting close to having the argument represented, right? So meat production going down means animals are never born. Not eating meat causes meat production to go down. Therefore, not eating meat means animals are never born. It is preferable to be killed than to never be born. Do we need something else? Yeah.
Killing animals is immoral. That kind of becomes one of the conclusions.
Is it a reason to believe the conclusion, though? So the question is killing animals, so certainly what they do here is they say, look, killing animals is immoral. And that's definitely a part of their kind of rhetorical move. But I'm not sure that it should be concluded as a premise because it's not actually a reason to believe the conclusion. It's what they're doing there is trying to build common ground with the vegetarians. They're saying, look, I agree with you that killing animals is immoral. And then you have this like, okay, so you diffused, if they thought they had to argue with you about that, they say, okay, now I don't have to argue with you about that. But that's really, I would suggest that that might be better interpreted as explanation or context. So just like this sentence, like, as I see it, most modern vegetarians believe animals have some degree of rights and that hence eating animals, which involves killing them, is wrong. Like, it's a good thing to have written because what you're trying to do is reach people, and the people that you're trying to reach believe all that. So you're building common ground with that other person, and you're saying, look, my argument does not depend on denying these things that you hold dear. But that's not exactly the same as being part of the positive argument that you're presenting. So really, it's only if something is a reason to believe the conclusion that you want to include it in the argument. Yeah? Okay.
proposing that animals like humans would rather be alive than dead,
Mm-hmm.
then not eating meat means animals are worse off.
Right, right. So, right. So we say if it's preferable to be killed than never be born, then we say then eating meat means animals are worse off. So good. So P5, basically saying if P1, then animals are better off. Yeah? I'm just being lazy. I'm trying not to write it very much. You should spell it out in your actual argument analyses. And maybe a missing premise here. So really what we want now is to connect P1 and P5 to the conclusion. If animals are better off, if something makes animals better off, then it's not immoral or something like that. Does that make sense? Just sort of a nice normative missing premise. Good. Okay, I think that's enough. I think that's enough to reconstruct this argument. So now we've got the conclusion, we've got the premises all laid out, we're ignoring everything else. Now let's map this thing. Okay, so once again, start from the conclusion because, I guess, start up here, make it more visible. So start from the conclusion and figure out what leads directly to it, and then kind of build your way backwards through the argument. So what do we say here? So it's preferable to be killed than never be born. If that's true, then they're better off. And if they're better off, then something is not immoral. How would you structure that? Yeah.
There would be three dependent premises.
Good. Good.
First would be that it's better off to be alive. It's better to be dead already than never be alive.
Yep.
Eating meat causes more animals to be alive.
No. Don't start with new premises. Use these premises.
Okay.
That's why we did all this, so that we could use these to build the map.
Eating meat causes
Tell me, just give me the names of the premises. Premise 1,
premise 3
premise 3,
and premise 5.
premise 5. If P1, then animals are better off. I think we need missing premise. I don't think premise 3 is in there, actually. I'm not sure that that's in that dependent relation. I think that's superstructure to that. So if it's preferable to be killed than to be born, than to never be born, P2, so not eating mammal, what do you think? This, yeah. P1, P2, and P5. And what about the missing premise here? I think that's important. It's like a 4-part dependent relation. So P1, it's preferable to be killed than to never be born. Not eating meat means animals are never born. If animals are better off, then something is, if P1, then animals are better off. And if they're better off, then it's not immoral. I think that's MP1. I think that's all one big dependent relation. Does that make sense? Okay, so what's left over? P3 and P4. So not eating meat causes meat production to go down. Meat production going down means animals are never born. Is it all just one huge dependent relation?
Well,
Yeah. This is,
say P3 and P4 lead to P, so P3 and P4 leads to P2.
good. Dependently or independently? So let's check this. So not eating meat caused meat production to go down. Meat production going down means animals are never born. Therefore, not eating meat means animals are never born. That works. That sounds right. Yeah? Ta-da! We mapped the argument. Hooray. That went better than I feared it would. I have sometimes attempted this for an argument that I've never mapped before, and it's just been a complete disastrous mess. We could not, even as a group, figure out how it should be structured. I think that's more likely to happen if you go sentence by sentence, because the sentence by sentence technique saddles you with a bunch of premises that it's hard to fit in. But if you step back and ask, okay, what are the main ideas, you're more likely to get a structure that makes sense. Yeah? The missing premise is if animals are better off because of something, then it is not immoral. So really we're just connecting this idea of immorality with being better off. You might not think that that's so transparent that it goes without saying. Yeah? Okay, so let me just reiterate that this is probably not the one and only one way of breaking this down. If you had identified these premises differently and there was room for doing that legitimately, this structure would look different. Certainly if you'd identified a different conclusion, then you'd have different premises and then the structure would be different, right? But the point of this is to take a text which is ambiguous in these regards. So it's not just written on the face of this text exactly how it's supposed to be structured. What we've done is extracted a structure from it, and now we can assess it. Okay, so move on to the next steps if we've got time. Have we got time? Oh my God, okay. So real quick, are any of these premises dumb? Do any of these premises make no sense? Yeah?
Well, we're arguing the rights of non-existent people with our rights of existing people.
Good, so that would be, which premise does that throw question on? So it's really helpful if you specifically say, here's where I get off the boat. P1. So P1 is preferable to be killed than to never be born. You don't have preferences. Yeah. So why should we care about the preferences of non-existent beings? That would be a really good reason to wonder whether that premise is true. And if that premise is true, and furthermore this is a huge dependent relation, then these premises don't lead to the conclusion. Yeah?
Also, it doesn't make sense to say that, it is better to be dead early than never be alive. I mean, it's just your own personal preference. You don't know.
So we need some argument. So we could say like, look, I don't believe this, and you need to give me an argument to believe it, right? So maybe there's an argument, but surely that hasn't been given here. Yeah? Good. Is there some problem? I think that we've got this into such a form that the relevance of these to the conclusion is pretty good. Right? So if these were all true, it seems like it would lead reasonably well to the conclusion. Does that seem right to you? I think this is, so we massaged it, we rephrased things, we kind of like made it fit into familiar argument patterns, and that brings it out how these premises are relevant to the conclusion. And now you can really home in on what parts of the argument you disagree with, saying, look, P1, I don't believe that bit. Good. Okay. Final comments? Yeah, yeah.
We're still talking about whether the premises could be true. Like P2 doesn't necessarily have to be true if you choose not to believe it.
Right, so P2, okay, so if you're gonna deny, because we've got, so P2 might be false, but because we've got this really nice relationship between P3 and P4 to P2, that means what you should do is question one of P3 or P4, right? Because if these two things are true, then P2 must also be true, yeah? Like it's a nice deductive argument. That means that there must be a problem either in P3 or P4. So not eating meat causes meat production to go down. Meat production going down means animals are never born. Like, well, actually, if you reforested the world, then lots of animals would be born. There's no reason to believe that there's going to be less animals in the world necessarily. Like, if you hadn't done all that clear cutting, maybe there'd be a lot more animals. Not cows, but maybe like monkeys and other stuff. So, good. That's a nice reason to question Okay, we're out of time. Try the other one on your own. The other one, I really think it's a worse argument than this one. It's really like, and there's more parts that are not really premises, so. Okay, thanks everyone.